Black single dad working as a janitor comforted a crying girl, unaware her mother owned the company. The fluorescent lights hummed their familiar tune as Daniel Carter pushed his mop bucket across the marble floor of Pinnacle Corporate Tower. At 47, his hands bore the calluses of a man who had worked with them his entire life, though these days they gripped a janitor's cart instead of the fine woodworking tools he once treasured. The lobby stretched before him like a cathedral of glass and steel, 30 floors of corporate dreams reaching toward the night sky. Most people saw grandeur when they walked through these doors during business hours. Daniel saw every scuff mark, every coffee stain, every piece of forgotten humanity that others left behind. Third floor conference rooms next, he muttered to himself, checking his worn clipboard. The building was his kingdom after 6 p.m., when the suits disappeared into their suburban lives and left him alone with their messes and his thoughts. His phone buzzed, a text from his 15-year-old son, Malik. "Dad, finished homework. Left dinner in fridge for you. Don't work too hard. Love you." Daniel's chest tightened with that familiar mix of pride and guilt. 3 years had passed since Sarah's sudden heart attack had turned their world upside down, leaving him to raise Malik alone. The boy was everything: honor roll student, basketball team captain, the kind of young man who made dinner for his father and never complained about their cramped apartment or second-hand clothes. "I'm doing this for you, son," Daniel whispered, tucking the phone back into his uniform pocket. He had been someone once. Daniel Carter Woodworks. That was the name painted on the workshop door before the fire took everything. Custom furniture, handcrafted toys, intricate jewelry boxes that sang with hidden music compartments. Wealthy clients from 3 states over used to wait months for his pieces. The newspaper had called him a master craftsman with golden hands. But golden hands couldn't prevent electrical fires. Golden hands couldn't bring back a wife trapped in smoke and flames. Golden hands couldn't pay medical bills and funeral costs and keep a traumatized 12-year-old boy in school. So golden hands learned to hold mops and empty trash cans, because that's what fathers do. They survive. They provide. They swallow their pride and show up every night with a smile, pretending that cleaning other people's success doesn't hollow out their soul a little more each day. Daniel began mopping near the main elevator bank, his movements methodical and practiced. The security guard, Jimmy, had made his rounds an hour ago. The building was supposed to be empty except for him, and whatever executives were pulling all-nighters on the upper floors. That's when he heard it. Soft. Barely audible over the hum of the HVAC system. A sound that made every parental instinct in his body snap to attention. Crying. Daniel stopped mopping, his ears straining. There it was again, not the dramatic sobbing of an adult, but the quiet, heartbroken whimpering of a child trying not to be heard. He followed the sound toward the seating area near the lobby's floor-to-ceiling windows, where expensive leather chairs formed conversation clusters that probably cost more than his monthly rent. The crying grew clearer as he approached a shadowy corner partially hidden by an oversized potted plant. And there she was. A little girl, maybe 8 years old, curled up in one of the massive chairs like a lost kitten. Her long dark hair fell around her face as she hunched over something in her lap, her small shoulders shaking with each suppressed sob. She wore a navy blue dress that looked expensive, with white tights and black patent leather shoes that dangled several inches from the floor. In her hands she clutched what appeared to be a wooden music box, but something was wrong with it. One of its delicate hinges hung loose, and a small carved piece dangled precariously from a thin wire. Daniel's heart clenched. Every fiber of his being as a father wanted to scoop up this child and comfort her, but he also knew the reality of his situation. A black man in a janitor's uniform approaching a crying white child in a corporate building at 10 p.m. He had to be careful. Very careful. "Excuse me, sweetheart," he said gently, keeping his distance and his voice soft. "Are you okay?" The girl looked up with eyes red from crying, and Daniel felt his breath catch. Those weren't just any tears. These were the tears of a child who understood loss in a way no 8-year-old should. She clutched the broken music box tighter against her chest. "I'm not supposed to be down here," she whispered. But I couldn't sit in that boring office anymore, and then I dropped it, and it broke, and now it won't play and… Her words tumbled over each other before dissolving into fresh tears. Daniel glanced around the empty lobby, then slowly approached, keeping his movements deliberate and non-threatening. What won't play, honey? She held up the music box with trembling hands. Even in the dim lobby lighting, Daniel could see the craftsmanship immediately. This wasn't some mass-produced toy store item. The wood was quality hardwood, possibly cherry, with intricate carved details along the edges. The joinery work was exceptional: dovetail corners, hand-fitted hinges, the kind of precision that spoke of old-world training. But more than the technique, something about the piece felt familiar. The way the corner molding curved, the specific floral pattern carved into the lid, the proportions and the grain selection. My daddy made this for me, the girl continued, her voice barely above a whisper. Before he went to heaven. It plays our special song, but now it's broken and I can't fix it, and Mommy's going to be so upset because she told me to be careful with it. Daniel's trained eye assessed the damage. The main hinge had come loose, probably from being dropped, and one of the small decorative elements had partially detached. To most people, it would look destroyed. To someone who understood fine woodworking, it was entirely reparable. What's your name, sweetheart? Daniel asked, kneeling down to her level. Sophie, she sniffled. What's yours? I'm Daniel. I work here at night, keeping everything clean and safe. He gestured toward his cart. Sophie, I know this is going to sound strange, but I think I might be able to help your music box. Would it be okay if I took a look? Hope flickered in her tear-stained eyes. Really? You can fix it? I used to work with wood a long time ago, Daniel said carefully. Before I worked here. I can't make any promises, but sometimes things that look broken just need someone who understands how they were made in the first place. Sophie studied his face with the intense scrutiny that only children possess, as if she could read his soul through his eyes. Whatever she saw there must have satisfied her, because she slowly extended the music box toward him. The moment Daniel's fingers touched the wood, his suspicions deepened. This wasn't just quality craftsmanship. This was the work of someone he might have known. The wood selection, the specific proportions, even the way the brass hinges had been set into the frame. It all felt hauntingly familiar, like hearing a half-remembered song from decades past. Tell me about your daddy, Daniel said as he gently examined the piece. What kind of work did he do? Mama says he was a businessman, but he loved making things with his hands. He had a workshop in our basement where he would disappear for hours. Sophie's voice grew wistful. He smelled like sawdust and something sweet. Mama called it wood stain. He taught me how to sand things until they felt smooth as silk. Daniel's hands stilled on the music box. The description, the technique, the unmistakable style of the joinery work. Puzzle pieces were clicking together in his mind, forming a picture that seemed impossible. But first, he had a promise to keep to a heartbroken little girl. Sophie, I'm going to try to fix this for you. But I need to get some tools from my cart. Will you be okay here for just a minute? She nodded eagerly, wiping her nose with the back of her hand. Daniel returned with a small toolkit he kept for minor building repairs, nothing fancy, but it included a few precision screwdrivers and some wood glue. As he worked, adjusting the tiny screws and carefully reseating the loose hinge, he found himself falling into the meditative rhythm he thought was lost forever. His hands remembered. Even after 3 years of mops and garbage bags, his fingers still knew how to coax wood and metal back into harmony. The repair took less than 10 minutes, but as Daniel worked, he felt something inside himself repair as well, a connection to the man he used to be, to the craftsman who had once created beauty with nothing but raw materials and vision. There, he said finally, setting the music box gently on the chair between them. Try opening it now. Sophie's hands trembled as she lifted the lid. The tiny ballerina inside began to turn, and the first notes of a delicate melody filled the lobby, a hauntingly beautiful tune that seemed to transform the sterile corporate space into something warm and alive. It works! Sophie gasped, her face lighting up with pure joy. You fixed it! You really fixed it. But Daniel wasn't looking at Sophie's happy face. He was staring at the music box, his mind reeling as recognition finally clicked into place. He knew this piece. Not just the style or the technique. He knew this exact music box. Because 20 years ago, he had watched his best friend and fellow apprentice craft it with his own hands, pouring love into every detail as he prepared for the birth of his first child. The friend he had lost touch with decades ago. The friend whose name had been Mark Moore. Daniel's mind raced as he stared at the music box, but Sophie's expectant face brought him back to the present. This little girl didn't need to know about his shock, she needed comfort and care. "Why are you here so late, sweetheart?" Daniel asked gently, settling into the chair across from her. "It's past bedtime for someone your age." Sophie clutched the now playing music box against her chest, the melody creating a soft soundtrack to their conversation. "Mama's still in an important meeting upstairs. She said it might go really late, but I can't go home without her." Her voice carried the resigned tone of a child who had spent many evenings waiting for a busy parent. "What floor is she on?" Daniel asked, though he suspected he already knew. The top floors were executive territory, the kind of place where million-dollar deals were made and corporate empires were built. "The very top one. She has the biggest office with windows that look out over the whole city." Sophie's voice held a mixture of pride and loneliness. "Sometimes I do my homework up there, but tonight the meeting had too many important grown-ups, so I had to wait in her office by myself." Daniel nodded understandingly. He'd cleaned those executive suites many times, sterile spaces filled with expensive furniture but lacking the warmth of a real home. No wonder she'd wandered down here. "Tell me about your music box," he said, hoping to lift her spirits. "When did your daddy make it for you?" Sophie's face transformed, lighting up with the kind of pure love that only children possess for their parents. "He started making it before I was even born. Mama showed me pictures of him working on it in his basement workshop. He said every little girl should have something special that plays her song." She opened the lid again, and the ballerina resumed her graceful dance. "This song was playing when I was born. Mama said Daddy cried when he heard it in the hospital, and that's when he knew it had to be our song." Daniel's throat tightened. The melody was Claire de Lune, the same piece Mark had hummed constantly during their apprenticeship, claiming it reminded him of moonlight on water. The same piece he'd sworn he would play for his future children. "He sounds like he was a wonderful father," Daniel said softly. "The best," Sophie whispered, her small fingers tracing the carved flowers on the box's lid. "He used to let me help in his workshop. I wasn't allowed to use the big scary tools, but I could sand things and hold pieces while he glued them. He said I had good hands for the work." She looked up at Daniel with sudden intensity. "You have good hands too. I can tell because you fixed my box just like Daddy would have." The innocence of her observation hit Daniel like a physical blow. Here was this child, recognizing something in him that the corporate world above them couldn't see, that he was more than just a janitor pushing a mop. "How long has your daddy been in heaven?" Daniel asked, though the question felt like stepping on sacred ground. 2 years, 3 months, and 16 days, Sophie replied with the precision that only comes from counting. "He got sick really fast. One day he was teaching me how to make dovetail joints with wooden blocks, and then he was in the hospital, and then..." She trailed off, but her meaning was clear. Daniel felt his heart breaking for this little girl who understood loss the way he understood wood grain, intimately and painfully. "I'm sorry, honey. That must have been very hard. Mama cries sometimes when she thinks I'm not looking," Sophie confided. "She works all the time now. She says Daddy left us the company, and she has to take care of it for both of them. But I think she's just scared of being sad." The wisdom in her words stunned Daniel. This 8-year-old had insights about grief that many adults never reached. "Sometimes grown-ups don't know how to be sad the right way," Daniel said carefully. "They think if they stay busy enough, the hurt won't catch up to them." "Is that why you clean offices at night instead of making beautiful things?" Sophie asked with the directness that only children possess. Daniel froze. How could she possibly know? But looking into her eyes, he realized she saw him the same way he was learning to see her, not as what the world labeled them, but as who they really were underneath. "How did you know I used to make things?" he asked. Sophie pointed to his hands. "Your fingers move like Daddy's did when he touched wood. Like you're reading it. And you knew exactly what was wrong with my music box without even thinking about it." She tilted her head. "What did you used to make?" "Furniture mostly. Toys sometimes. Things that were meant to last generations." Daniel found himself opening up to this child in a way he hadn't with another soul since Sarah's death. "I had a workshop where everything smelled like sawdust and lemon oil, just like your daddy's. What happened to it?" The simple question held no judgment, only curiosity. Daniel took a deep breath. "There was a fire. I lost everything, my workshop, my home, my wife. After that, I just needed work that would pay the bills so I could take care of my son." Sophie was quiet for a long moment, processing this information with the seriousness of a much older person. Finally, she spoke. "Daddy always said that the most important tools weren't in his workshop. They were in his hands and his heart. He said those could never be lost in a fire." The profound truth of her words, spoken in her father's voice, nearly undid Daniel completely. Mark had always been philosophical about their craft, seeing deeper meaning in every joint and curve. "Your daddy was a very wise man," Daniel managed. "Maybe you could teach me sometime," Sophie said hopefully. "About woodworking, I mean. Mama doesn't know anything about it, and I miss making things with my hands." Before Daniel could respond, the elevator chimed, its mechanical voice announcing an arrival from the top floor. They both turned to see the doors slide open, revealing a tall, elegant woman in an expensive navy suit. Even from across the lobby, Daniel could see the exhaustion in her posture and the worry lines around her eyes. Sophie jumped up, music box in hand. "Mama!" The woman's face transformed with relief as she spotted her daughter, but her expression grew puzzled when she noticed Daniel kneeling beside the chair. "Sophie, honey, what are you doing down here?" she asked, her heels clicking against the marble as she approached. Her voice carried the authority of someone accustomed to being obeyed, but underneath lay the tenderness of a mother who had been genuinely worried. "This is Daniel, Mama. He fixed my music box. Listen!" Sophie opened the lid, and Claire de Lune filled the space between them. The woman's eyes widened slightly as she took in the scene, her daughter, clearly happy and safe, with a janitor who had somehow repaired the irreplaceable treasure she'd been told was unfixable. "Thank you," she said to Daniel, her tone polite but distant. "I appreciate you looking after her. Sophie, we need to get home. It's very late." But Daniel noticed she hadn't really looked at the music box. Hadn't heard the significance of the melody, or recognized the quality of the repair. She saw only what she expected to see, a service employee who had done his job. As Sophie gathered her things, chattering excitedly about their conversation, Daniel caught the woman's eye. For just a moment, he thought he saw something familiar in her features, but it was gone too quickly to place. "Come along, Sophie," the woman said, taking her daughter's hand. "Tell Daniel goodbye." "Bye, Daniel," Sophie called as they walked toward the exit. "Thank you for fixing my music box and for talking to me about Daddy." And then they were gone, leaving Daniel alone in the lobby with his mop bucket, and the echo of Mark Moore's masterpiece still playing in his mind. 3 nights later, Daniel was buffing the lobby floors when he heard the familiar ding of the elevator. He glanced at his watch, 11:47 p.m. Later than usual for even the most dedicated executives. "Daniel!" He turned to see Sophie practically bouncing out of the elevator, her mother trailing behind with an expression that mixed exhaustion with barely concealed frustration. "Sophie, slow down," Elena Moore called, but there was no real authority in her voice. She looked like a woman who had been worn down by too many late nights and too many battles she wasn't sure how to win. Sophie ignored her mother's plea and ran straight to Daniel. "I brought something to show you," she announced, clutching a small wooden box against her chest. "Sophie," Elena said more firmly, finally catching up. "Mr. I'm sorry, I don't know your last name. Carter, Daniel supplied. Daniel Carter. Mr. Carter is working, honey. We can't interrupt him every time we. It's okay, Daniel said gently, setting down his buffer. I don't mind the company. The truth was, he'd been hoping to see them again. For 3 nights, he'd found himself glancing toward the elevators, wondering about the little girl who'd recognized something in him that he thought was buried forever. Sophie beamed up at him. I found another box Daddy made. Look. She opened the wooden container to reveal an assortment of small carved animals: an elephant, a giraffe, a lion with an intricately detailed mane. Daniel's breath caught. Each piece bore Mark's unmistakable style, the same attention to detail, the same flowing curves, the same perfectionist approach to even the smallest elements. But these were different from the music box. These were clearly earlier works, probably from when Mark was still learning, still finding his artistic voice. These are beautiful, Daniel said, picking up the tiny elephant. The wood was smooth as silk, each wrinkle and fold carved with loving precision. Your daddy was very talented. Mama says he made these before I was born, when he was learning how to be a carpenter. Sophie explained. She found them in a box in the attic last week. There's a whole bunch of them. Elena stepped closer, her business facade softening slightly as she watched her daughter's enthusiasm. The box was labeled Practice Pieces 1997. There must be 30 or 40 small carvings in there. I had no idea Mark had made so many. Daniel's mind raced. 1997. That would have been right around the time he and Mark were finishing their apprenticeship under old Heinrich Müller. Heinrich had insisted they each complete 50 small projects before he'd let them touch anything larger than a bread box. Did your husband ever mention where he learned woodworking? Daniel asked carefully. Elena's expression grew distant. He was always vague about it. Said he'd studied under some old German craftsman in his 20s, but that was before we met. Mark didn't like talking about the past much. She paused, studying Daniel's face. Why do you ask? Before Daniel could answer, Sophie had settled herself cross-legged on the floor, arranging the carved animals in elaborate scenarios. Daniel used to make things too, Mama. He had a workshop that smelled like sawdust and lemon oil, just like Daddy's. Elena's eyebrows rose. You're a woodworker? Was, Daniel corrected quickly. A long time ago. But Sophie wasn't finished. He knows all about dovetail joints and wood grain and everything. And he could tell just by touching my music box exactly what was wrong with it. She looked up at her mother with innocent enthusiasm. Maybe he knew Daddy. Wouldn't that be amazing? The lobby fell silent except for the distant hum of the building's ventilation system. Elena stared at Daniel with new interest, as if seeing him for the first time. Not just a janitor, but a person with a history, with skills, with a story that might somehow intersect with her own. Where did you train? She asked quietly. Daniel hesitated. The truth felt too incredible, too coincidental. But looking down at Sophie, who was making the wooden giraffe talk to the elephant in a high, silly voice, he decided that honesty might be worth the risk of disbelief. Under Heinrich Müller on the south side. Traditional German woodworking techniques. I was there from 1995 to 1998. Elena's face went pale. Heinrich Müller? You know the name? Mark used to mention him. Said he was the best craftsman in the state, but tough as nails. He'd make his apprentices redo projects 20 times until they were perfect. She stared at Daniel with growing amazement. You were there at the same time as Mark? We were workshop partners for 3 years, Daniel said softly. Best friends, actually. We learned everything together. How to read wood grain, how to select the right tools, how to make joints so tight they'd last centuries. He picked up the wooden lion, running his thumb over the familiar craftsmanship. Mark was better than me at the detail work. Always had more patience for the tiny things. Sophie had stopped playing and was looking back and forth between the adults, sensing the importance of the conversation even if she didn't fully understand it. Mark talked about a workshop partner, Elena said slowly. Someone named D. Danny? He said they were going to start a business together after they finished their training. That was the plan. Daniel confirmed, his voice heavy with old memories. Moore and Carter Custom Woodworks. We had it all figured out. He'd handle the fine detail pieces, I'd do the larger furniture. We were going to revolutionize traditional craftsmanship. What happened? Daniel looked down at his janitor's uniform, then back at Elena's expectant face. Life happened. We graduated, and Mark got married right away. Started working for his father-in-law's company. I was invited to the wedding, but I was struggling to get my own workshop started, working 3 jobs to pay rent. I kept meaning to reach out, but months turned into years, and then... He shrugged. You know how it is. People drift apart. Elena was quiet for a long moment, processing this revelation. He never forgot you, she said finally. Even years later, he'd sometimes mention his old partner Danny when he was working on a particularly challenging piece. He said you could look at a piece of wood and see the finished project inside it, like a sculptor seeing a statue in a block of marble. The compliment, delivered in Mark's voice through his widow's memory, hit Daniel harder than he'd expected. For 3 years, he'd convinced himself that his old skills were meaningless, that he was just a janitor now and always would be. Can you teach me? Sophie asked suddenly, looking up from her menagerie of wooden animals. Like you and Daddy learned together? Sophie. Elena started to protest, but Daniel held up a gentle hand. I don't have a workshop anymore, sweetheart, he said. And teaching requires proper tools, proper space. But you still know how, right? Sophie pressed. Mama, he could teach me what Daddy never got the chance to. Elena looked at Daniel with an expression he couldn't quite read, part curiosity, part calculation, part something that might have been hope. The elevator chimed again, and all 3 of them turned to see the security guard, Jimmy, step out. Ms. Moore? Everything all right down here? Saw you on the cameras talking to. His eyes landed on Daniel, and his tone shifted slightly. Carter. Everything's fine, Jimmy, Elena said smoothly. Just having a conversation. But as Jimmy nodded and returned to the elevator, Daniel caught the subtle message in the exchange. Even here, even in this moment of connection and possibility, the world saw what it expected to see, a wealthy executive, her daughter, and the night janitor who needed to be watched. 2 weeks passed before Daniel saw them again, though he found himself thinking about Sophie and Elena daily. Their conversation had stirred something in him that he'd thought was permanently buried, not just the memory of his friendship with Mark, but a flicker of hope that maybe, somehow, his old skills still mattered. He was cleaning the executive conference room on the 15th floor when he heard familiar voices echoing from the hallway. Through the glass walls, he could see Elena leading a group of well-dressed adults toward the large corner office that overlooked the city. Sophie trailed behind, clutching a small bag and looking resigned to another evening of waiting while her mother worked. Daniel quickly finished wiping down the conference table and moved his cart toward the elevators, not wanting to intrude on what was clearly an important business meeting. But as he waited for the elevator, Sophie spotted him through the office window and waved enthusiastically. Elena noticed her daughter's distraction and glanced over, catching sight of Daniel. She said something to the men in suits, then stepped out of the office. Daniel, she called softly. Could I speak with you for a moment? He approached cautiously, aware that her colleagues were watching through the glass walls with obvious curiosity. There's a company family event this Saturday, Elena said, her voice professional but warm. A picnic in Riverside Park for employees and their children. Sophie has been asking if you might come. Daniel glanced toward the office where Sophie was pressing her face against the window, grinning at him. The sight made him smile despite his uncertainty. I appreciate the invitation, Ms. Moore, but I'm not sure that's appropriate. I'm just... You're someone who knew my husband, Elena interrupted gently. Someone who meant something to him, even if you lost touch. That makes you part of our story, whether you realize it or not. Before Daniel could respond, one of the executives called Elena back to the meeting. She squeezed his arm briefly. Think about it. Sophie would be thrilled. Saturday arrived bright and clear, and Daniel found himself standing at the edge of Riverside Park feeling completely out of place. Families clustered around picnic tables, children ran through sprinklers, and executives who probably made more in a month than he did in a year flipped burgers on expensive grills. He was about to leave when Sophie spotted him from across the park. "Daniel!" she shrieked, abandoning a group of children her age and running toward him at full speed. "You came! You really came!" Elena looked up from her conversation with several board members, her face lighting up with genuine pleasure when she saw him. She excused herself and walked over, looking more relaxed than he'd ever seen her in jeans and a simple white blouse. "I'm so glad you decided to come," she said. "Sophie's been talking about you nonstop all week. I brought something special to show you," Sophie announced, digging into her small backpack. "Mama found more of Daddy's things in the attic." She pulled out the music box, but Daniel immediately noticed something different about it. The wood seemed to glow in the afternoon sunlight, and when Sophie opened it, the melody that emerged was crystal clear, stronger and more beautiful than it had been in the lobby. "It sounds different," Daniel observed. "That's because Mama had it professionally cleaned and tuned," Sophie explained proudly. "She took it to a fancy music box shop, and they said whoever repaired it did museum-quality work. They wanted to know who fixed it." Elena's eyes met Daniel's over Sophie's head. "The shop owner spent 20 minutes examining your repair work. He said he'd never seen joinery that precise done with basic tools in a corporate lobby. He kept asking where I'd found such a skilled craftsman." Daniel felt heat rise in his cheeks. "It was just a simple fix." "No, it wasn't," Elena said firmly. And this confirmed it. She reached into her own bag and pulled out a manila folder. "Sophie, why don't you go play with the other children while Daniel and I talk?" Sophie looked between them with the intuitive understanding that only children possess. "You're going to talk about grown-up things, aren't you?" "Just for a few minutes," Elena promised. "Then we'll have lunch and you can show Daniel the playground." After Sophie skipped away, Elena opened the folder and handed Daniel a photograph. It showed two young men in their 20s, covered in sawdust and grinning at the camera. One was clearly a younger version of Daniel. The other was Mark Moore, his arms slung around Daniel's shoulder like they were brothers. "I found this in Mark's old workshop box," Elena said softly, "along with several others." She showed him more photos, Daniel and Mark working side by side on various projects, both of them laughing at some shared joke, both of them holding up a completed jewelry box with obvious pride. "There's an inscription on the back of this one," Elena said, turning over the photo of them with the jewelry box. In Mark's familiar handwriting were the words, "D&M Best Partnership Ever. This is just the beginning. 1998. Daniel stared at the photo, his throat tight with emotion. He remembered that day clearly. They just finished their final project under Heinrich's supervision, and they'd been so proud, so sure that the world was waiting for their unique brand of craftsmanship. "There's more," Elena continued, pulling out a business card holder made of rich cherry wood. "Mark made this, but look at the inscription inside the lid." Daniel opened it and read the carefully carved words. "For my partner Danny, may we build beautiful things together for the rest of our lives." The world seemed to tilt slightly. In his hands was proof that their friendship had meant as much to Mark as it had to him, that even after they'd lost touch, Mark had kept these mementos of their time together. "Sophie," Elena called. "Come here, honey. I want to show you something." Sophie bounded back over, her cheeks flushed from running. "Look at this," Elena said, showing her daughter the photo of Daniel and Mark. "This is Daniel with your daddy when they were young." Sophie's eyes widened as she studied the picture. "You both look so happy. And Daddy looks just like he did in the pictures in Mama's bedroom." "They were best friends," Elena explained. "They learned woodworking together and dreamed of starting a business together." Sophie looked up at Daniel with new understanding. "So you really did know my daddy. You weren't just being nice. Your daddy was like a brother to me," Daniel said, his voice rough with emotion. I loved him very much. Sophie suddenly threw her arms around Daniel's waist, hugging him tightly. Now I have someone who knew Daddy when he was young. Someone who can tell me stories Mama doesn't know. Over Sophie's head, Daniel met Elena's eyes. In them, he saw not pity or charity, but recognition. She was finally seeing him not as the janitor who cleaned her building, but as the craftsman who had once been her husband's closest friend, the missing piece of Mark's story that she'd never known existed. Daniel, she said quietly, I think we need to have a much longer conversation. The following Monday evening, Elena waited in the lobby long after her usual departure time. When Daniel emerged from the elevator with his cleaning cart, she was sitting in the same chair where he'd first found Sophie, a thick manila folder on her lap. Ms. Moore, Daniel said, surprised. Is everything all right? Where's Sophie? She's at her grandmother's tonight, Elena replied, standing. I needed to speak with you privately. She gestured to the seating area. Please sit. I've learned some things about you that I think you should know I know. Daniel's stomach tightened. In his experience, when wealthy people investigated janitors, it rarely ended well. What kind of things? Elena opened the folder and pulled out several printed documents. I had my assistant do some research. I hope you don't mind, but after seeing those photographs, I had to understand what happened to Mark's best friend. Why someone with your skills was working nights in my building. She handed him the first document, a newspaper clipping from 4 years ago. The headline read, Local craftsman loses everything in workshop fire. Below it was a photo of Daniel standing in front of the charred remains of what had once been his dream. Daniel Carter Woodworks, Elena read aloud. Custom furniture and heirloom restoration. The article says you were considered one of the finest craftsmen in the state. Your pieces were in museums and private collections across the country. Daniel stared at the clipping, remembering that day with painful clarity. The reporter had been kind but persistent, wanting to capture the human interest angle of a man who'd lost everything in a single night. The fire was electrical, Elena continued, pulling out more documents. Started in the wiring behind your workshop wall and spread to the adjoining house where you lived with your wife and son. The article says your wife. She paused, her voice softening. I'm so sorry, Daniel. I can't imagine losing everything like that. Sarah tried to save some of my tools, Daniel said quietly. She went back into the house for a box of hand planes that had belonged to my grandfather. The smoke got her before she could get out. He took a shaky breath. Malik was at basketball practice. If he'd been home. Elena was quiet for a moment, letting the weight of his loss settle between them. The insurance settlement wasn't enough to rebuild, was it? Daniel shook his head. Barely covered Sarah's medical bills and funeral costs. I had some money saved, but not enough to start over from nothing. And honestly, I didn't have the heart for it anymore. Everything I touched seemed to turn to ash. So you took whatever work you could find to support your son. Malik was 12. He just lost his mother and watched his father's entire world burn down. He needed stability, needed to know that no matter what, I'd be there to take care of him. Daniel managed a bitter smile. Turns out stability pays minimum wage and works night shifts. Elena pulled out another document. You've been working here for 3 years. Perfect attendance, commendations from building management, never a single complaint. Your supervisor says you're the most reliable employee they've ever had. Why are you telling me this? Daniel asked, though he thought he might know. Because I also found this, Elena said, producing a final set of papers. Plans for Daniel Carter Custom Restoration. Filed with the State Business Bureau 6 months ago, then withdrawn a week later. Daniel's cheeks burned. Those plans represented a moment of weakness, a middle-of-the-night fantasy when he'd convinced himself he could start small, maybe do simple repairs for neighbors, build slowly back towards something that mattered. I withdrew them because I realized I was being foolish, he said. I don't have startup capital, I don't have tools, I don't have a workspace. Most importantly, I don't have time. Malik's a junior now, looking at colleges. He needs me to be practical, not chasing dreams that died in a fire. What if you didn't need startup capital? Elena asked quietly. What if the workspace and tools were provided? What if you could pursue your craft while still being there for your son? Daniel looked at her sharply. What are you suggesting? Elena leaned forward, her eyes bright with an excitement he'd never seen before. Pinnacle Corporation has a philanthropic division. We fund arts programs, preserve historical buildings, support cultural initiatives. 6 months ago, the board approved a new program, Heritage Craft Preservation. We're looking for master craftsmen to restore antique pieces for museums and historical societies. Elena, the position comes with a full workshop, the finest tools money can buy, and a salary that would let you work normal hours. You'd have benefits, job security, and the chance to do what you were born to do. She paused. You'd also be working in the same building where Sophie and I spend our days. She could learn from you, the way she always dreamed of learning from her father. Daniel felt like the floor was shifting beneath him. You're offering me a job? Just like that? I'm offering you what should have been offered 3 years ago, if anyone had bothered to look past the uniform and see who you really are. Elena's voice grew fierce. You're not just a janitor, Daniel. You're a master craftsman who's been wasting his talents because the world couldn't see past its own prejudices. Why? Daniel asked. Why would you do this for someone you barely know? Elena was quiet for a long moment, looking down at the photographs scattered between them. Because Mark loved you like a brother, and I never got to meet you while he was alive. Because Sophie lights up when she talks about you in a way she hasn't since her father died. Because 3 years ago, when you needed help, no one was there to offer it. She looked up, meeting his eyes directly. But mostly because I've watched you with my daughter, and I've seen the man you are. You fixed her broken music box when everyone else said it was impossible. You listened to her stories about her father without judgment or impatience. You treated a lonely little girl like she mattered, even when you had every reason to focus on your own work. Daniel felt tears threatening. Elena, I don't know what to say. Say you'll think about it, she replied. Say you'll let me help you become who you were meant to be again. Daniel looked down at the newspaper clipping, at the photograph of his burned workshop, at the withdrawn business plans that represented his abandoned hope. Then he looked at Elena, Mark's widow, Sophie's mother, the woman who was offering him a chance to reclaim not just his livelihood, but his identity. There's something else, Elena said softly. Something I haven't told Sophie yet. She pulled out one final photograph, Mark at work in his basement workshop, but in the background, partially visible on a shelf, was a wooden sign that read, Moore and Carter Custom Woodworks. He never forgot your dream, she said. Even after you lost touch, he kept that sign. I think he always hoped you'd find your way back to each other. Daniel stared at the photograph, seeing in it not just Mark, but the ghost of the partnership they planned, the future they dreamed of, the brotherhood that had survived even decades of separation. I'll think about it, he whispered, and for the first time in 3 years, he allowed himself to believe that maybe, just maybe, it wasn't too late to start over. 3 months later, Daniel stood in the doorway of what had once been an unused storage space on the 10th floor of Pinnacle Tower. Now it was a fully equipped woodworking shop that would have made Heinrich Müller weep with joy. German-made hand planes lined one wall, their brass fittings gleaming under the workshop lights. A massive workbench dominated the center of the room, its surface scarred and seasoned from decades of use. Elena had found it at an estate sale, claiming it reminded her of the one in Mark's old photographs. The smell of lemon oil and sawdust filled the air, a perfume Daniel had thought he'd never breathe again. It's perfect, he said for the 10th time that morning, running his fingers along the edge of a nearly completed jewelry box. His first commissioned piece for the Heritage Restoration Program. Daddy would have loved this place, Sophie said from her perch on a tall stool beside the workbench. She'd become his most faithful assistant over the past month, arriving after school to sand pieces and organize tools with the same methodical precision her father had once shown. Your daddy would have loved watching you learn, Daniel replied, handing her a piece of fine-grained sandpaper. He always said the most important part of woodworking wasn't the tools or the technique. It was passing the knowledge to the next generation. Sophie beamed as she began carefully smoothing the surface of a small wooden bird he'd carved for her to practice on. Her movements were confident now, her touch sure and gentle. She had her father's hands. The workshop door opened, and Elena stepped in carrying 2 steaming cups of coffee and a juice box for Sophie. She'd made this a daily ritual, stopping by to check on their progress and steal a few minutes of peace from her executive responsibilities. "How's the museum piece coming?" she asked, nodding toward the jewelry box. "Almost finished," Daniel said, accepting the coffee gratefully. "The museum director is going to be thrilled. This is one of Heinrich's early pieces, probably from the 1960s. The joinery is extraordinary, but time had loosened some of the connections." He opened the box carefully, revealing the restored interior with its tiny compartments and hidden drawer. The wood glowed with renewed life, each grain pattern telling its story of decades past. "It's beautiful," Elena said softly. "Just like everything else you've created here." She gestured around the workshop, which had become a gallery of Daniel's restored pieces over the past few months. Antique chairs sat alongside vintage music boxes, each one brought back from the edge of decay through his patient craftsmanship. "I got the call from the Children's Hospital today," Elena continued. "They want to commission you to build custom toy chests for the pediatric wing. Hand-carved animals on the fronts, personalized for each child." Daniel's chest swelled with pride. Word was spreading about his work, and the commissions were coming in faster than he could complete them. But more than the professional success, he felt the deep satisfaction of purpose restored. "There's something else," Elena said, her voice carrying a note of excitement. "Sophie, why don't you tell Daniel about your idea?" Sophie set down her sandpaper and turned to face him, her eyes bright with enthusiasm. "I want to start a club at school. A woodworking club for kids who don't have daddies to teach them. You could come once a week and show us how to make simple things, like the bird boxes we've been practicing." Daniel felt his throat tighten with emotion. "Sophie, that's a wonderful idea, but I'm not sure the school would." "Already approved," Elena interrupted with a grin. "The principal loved the concept. They're setting up a small workshop space, and they want to start next month. You'd be teaching 12 kids every Thursday afternoon." Daniel looked around his workshop, his sanctuary, his second chance, his redemption, and realized it was about to become something even more meaningful. A place where broken things were made whole again, where lost skills were passed to eager hands, where the future was carved from the dreams of the past. "Your mama and daddy would be so proud of you," he told Sophie, who immediately launched herself off her stool to hug him tightly. Over her head, he met Elena's eyes. In the 3 months since she'd offered him this position, she'd become more than just his employer. She'd become family, the sister-in-law he never had the chance to know, the friend who'd seen his worth when he'd forgotten it himself. "Thank you," he said simply, but the words carried the weight of everything: his gratitude for the second chance, his amazement at the generosity that had restored his life, his wonder at finding himself surrounded by people who valued not just his skills, but his heart. "Thank Mark," Elena replied softly. "This was always his dream, that you'd find your way back to woodworking. I just had the privilege of making it happen." As if summoned by their conversation, the music box on Daniel's workbench began to play. Sophie had wound it during her arrival, and now, Claire de Lune filled the workshop with its gentle melody. The same song that had brought them together in a corporate lobby was now the soundtrack to their new beginning. Daniel picked up his hand plane, feeling its familiar weight, breathing in the scent of wood shavings and possibility. Sophie climbed back onto her stool, ready to learn, while Elena settled into the chair she'd claimed as her own, content to watch 2 generations of craftspeople at work. In the late afternoon, sunlight streaming through the workshop windows, sawdust danced like golden confetti, and the sound of careful work filled the air. It was a symphony of restoration, not just of antique pieces, but of dreams, relationships, and hope itself. Sometimes, the most broken things really were just waiting for the right hands to make them whole again. And sometimes, those hands belonged to someone who had been broken too, someone who understood that the most beautiful creations came from the deepest scars, the hardest lessons, and the longest journeys home. The music box played on, its melody weaving through the workshop like a blessing, like a promise, like the sound of a heart learning to hope again.